Hi everyone. Out here on the trail in Sedona to make the next video, and I'm not totally sure what I'm going to say in this one, but it's along the lines of the following. So, and I want to acknowledge first of all of your great comments and sharing on Ken Wilber. There's a lot of great insight in everything you say, and certainly he's not, even though some of us have the reaction that I originally did, that which was expressed in "Where have you been all my life, Ken Wilber?" But that's an understandable reaction. But I think behind that, and to others of you, there's also a more cautious acceptance or look at Ken Wilber, and ultimately rightly so. And I want to talk about, try and relate two seemingly separated things, which is that first of all, on a course like this, we're talking about the origins and evolution of human consciousness. It would be really easy for us to go through this course in a largely intellectual way, so that it's to treat it as an intellectual subject, to try and be objective about the subject of the origin and destiny of human consciousness, and I think that is not actually a productive way to go. And it's not that we wouldn't want to use our intellect. We do, and we will. But when we're talking about consciousness, then and if the intellect were indeed sort of a part of consciousness, it's a small part of consciousness, and so consciousness is much larger than that. And so we want to at least try to bring in a wider spectrum of consciousness into this course as we go. And that involves you guys basically going into your own consciousness, and not only in currently, but also the history of your own consciousness. And so that then we can sort of bring in an experiential part of it, because if consciousness is anything, ultimately it's our connection to it is via experience. I'm going to wait for this plane to go. This hike is near Sedona Airport, so it just take off right by me. So obviously there's the subconscious or an unconscious, but we know that consciousness is probably operating beneath the level of awareness of a lot of the time. So there's that going on, but and then perhaps this really relates to the evolution of consciousness. How much are we aware, or how much are we aware of our own consciousness? And that's a process that may expand over time, right? So, and that actually might be, and I think this came out in one discussion online, we might actually say that is the evolution of consciousness, that we become increasingly aware of consciousness as we go, and thereby have a greater range and expanse of using it, and it's going to affect our worldview and everything we do. So I wanted to say that. So I want to encourage you in this course to not be shy about bringing in your own experience, and that experience includes your reactions to the material. Now, reactions is one word, and then on a deeper level there's a kind of response. So I encourage you, so in a contemplative way with this material, can you get down to sort of a deeper response to the material? And I think some of you are finding on an intuitive level that's kind of a resistance to some of this material. There's a kind of an objection on a deeper level. Those things are to be paid attention to, as are our most superficial reactions and opinions. That's all there. But getting down into this, what out of the material do you connect with, that you respond, are you drawn towards on a deeper level, and what are you not on this sort of deeper level? This is happening in consciousness, right? Your consciousness. And so that's relevant to the Course. What's happening in your consciousness is relevant to the Course. And so let's go as deep as we can in our awareness of that. So we could treat this Course, you could call it kind of a mindfulness exercise. I'd rather call it contemplative, because I don't personally like the idea of being full of mind. I'd rather be heartful or soulful or something like that. But mindful is one of those words we've come to use. Just paying attention to what's going on all levels within, and to try and bring that in. We may be interacting with intellectual material, and so it seems very distant from these deeper reactions, but it isn't. Even intellectual material has impacts and plugs into us on mythological levels, metaphorical levels. There's all kinds of ways that ideas and intellectual material can be important at levels that might surprise us. So let's all try and do that as we go. I'll try and do that personally. And so in Ken Wilber's material, I do believe there are some like little jewels, and your deeper consciousness will find those jewels. And so let's take note of those and bring them out. All of you, if you can, bring out what are the jewels you're finding, and where is your consciousness saying, I don't need to go that way. Your deeper response going like that. And let's trust, begin to trust a deeper knowing and a deeper intelligence that's part of our consciousness in the process of going through this Course. And then what I want to say about that is it sort of plugs me into Wilber, because I think there's lots of criticisms that I could have of Ken Wilber, and you guys have brought up a lot of them, but ultimately the world looks to us how it looks from the perspective of where we're at inwardly, right? So it's like if consciousness is, if we're allowing that consciousness, say, is something that does evolve, then wherever I'm at in my consciousness, that's gonna control largely to how the world looks to me, what the world looks like. So from Ken Wilber's own model, here we may say that we are getting close to, as a culture, to the rational stage. Well, his approach is essentially rational. And his approach, a lot of you guys have kind of lined him up with a scientific approach. Well, he's actually not at all mainstream science, not at all accepted by mainstream science. He's well outside of it. But I see why you do that, because he's trying to take this objective approach. So he's trying to distance himself from the whole thing, from the evolution of consciousness, step outside of it, and then talk about it from an objective stance. And primarily he's rooting around through vast amounts of information and rationally deciding, rationally putting together an argument. Well, obviously what we're going to get there is the way the world looks to Ken Wilber from a rational perspective, a rational level of consciousness. And that's a limitation, right? First of all, with respect to consciousness, one can't be objective about it because one is inside of it. We're inside of consciousness. So we're looking out. So we are consciousness. So you can't really be objective about it. And so you're going to get fooled in this process. And I do believe that on some deep level, Ken Wilber has fooled himself. It doesn't mean that there's not some kind of beauty or value in everything he's produced. But on some level, he's coming at the world from he's coming with the spectacles on that he has, and it reflects his consciousness, where he's at. Now, if we could shift that, then the world would look differently to Ken Wilber. And and you wouldn't have such a sort of linear hierarchical model. Linear hierarchical model really reflects where he's at, right? It is reflective of a certain kind of consciousness, and we know it all too well in our culture because it is connected to the scientific view, and that's things are causal. One thing affects another. They progress. The very idea of progress itself came during the scientific revolution. We wouldn't even have an idea of progress towards something if it wasn't for science. So it's all really coming down to a particular kind of pair of spectacles. You might call it a consciousness, a kind of consciousness that exists in our world that he's really using to try and distill something that's much greater than that and put it into this model that's even much smaller. And I always find it amusing that he uses the analogy of flatland. He says that the modern scientific materialist view has collapsed all these levels of the great chain of being into a kind of flatland. And I really think that he's open to that criticism himself, that his model is flatland, essentially. So, and so that would be my main criticism, but there's a scad of others. I mean, the pre-trans fallacy, I want to say, just be always aware that the pre-trans fallacy, okay, if we accept that it exists, then we also have to accept that there's such a thing as the trans-pre fallacy. And I think Ken Wilber is guilty of the trans-pre fallacy quite frequently when he judges archaic cultures and indigenous cultures and myth and mythology in general. Joseph Campbell gets a terrible treatment by Ken Wilber. And I happen to think that Joseph Campbell's work is extremely valuable and not limited in the way that Ken Wilber would say that it is. And this includes also the work of Carl Jung as well. So, hopefully, so that's one. There's a way that as moderns, and especially within the realm of academia, we've treated indigenous people. So the indigenous people thinks the world's alive. These rocks around me are alive. There are rock people. The tree is alive. There's tree spirits, that kind of thing. Well, in academia, in a pejorative sense, these things were called primitive animism. I would say that Ken Wilber pretty much walks right into that. He doesn't use the word primitive animism, but he essentially casts indigenous worldviews that way. I just don't agree with it. I think there's a kind of reality that he's not seeing, that he's not sensitive to. That's a different kind of consciousness. So we have to allow that models could be more complex. Maybe there are multiple different kinds of lines, and maybe it's not linear and all of this kind of thing. And I don't think we really have to worry about that, really. Ultimately, again, listen to the deeper inner voice, I think, here, because we don't want to get into this with our minds. And the temptation with Ken Wilber is to get into a real kind of mental battle with the material. And I don't think it's ultimately productive to go there. He will draw one into that because that's where he's at. But I don't think that's the way to go. So let's you and I trust what the deeper knowing, the deeper parts of our consciousness and spirit, our hearts even, and then come at it from there, which means we'll give it a fair go. We will, and there'll be some great things in it. But we're going to go into things that are far less linear, logical, and rational. And so it's going to be interesting to see how we deal with those two.